The courtroom was alive with the usual hum of anticipation, as if the very walls vibrated with the weight of countless previous cases. The sound of lawyers rustling papers, the soft murmurs of spectators whispering in hushed tones, and the distant, rhythmic thudding of a gavel striking in another chamber formed a familiar soundtrack. The air was thick with a sense of expectation. Today, yet another life would be weighed in this cold, impersonal space. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat at the bench, her posture impeccable. She was the epitome of professionalism, her gaze steady as she surveyed the room. Her hands rested on the polished oak of the bench, fingers lightly drumming a nervous rhythm that belied her composed exterior. It was another day, another case. At least, that's what she thought. The bailiff called the case in a clear, firm voice. The state of Louisiana versus James Anderson. Eleanor shifted in her seat slightly, her mind already working through the legalities of what lay ahead. She glanced at the charges in front of her: assault, robbery, resisting arrest. She felt a familiar ache of disappointment settle in her chest. Another lost soul caught in the web of the system. Another story of crime, punishment, and the never-ending cycle of misfortune that seemed to define this part of the world. But then, the defendant was brought into the courtroom, and everything stopped. The world tilted. The man standing before her, shackled at the wrists and ankles, was not a stranger. He was James Anderson. Her James. Her throat tightened, a flood of memories surging forward like a wave threatening to drown her. The summer afternoons they spent racing bicycles down the dusty streets of Hammond, Louisiana. The late-night talks under the magnolia tree in her backyard. Secrets shared in the privacy of a friendship that no one could understand. The promises they made as kids, to always have each other's backs, no matter what. But the man standing before her wasn't the boy she remembered. His shoulders were hunched, his face lined with years of hardship. The carefree, exuberant boy she once knew had been replaced by a man hardened by life's brutal realities. Yet, his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were unmistakable. They hadn't changed, despite everything else. Eleanor's heart fluttered painfully in her chest. For the first time in her career, her hand faltered as she reached for the gavel. She hesitated. The weight of this moment felt unbearable. The room seemed to shrink around her. The walls pressed in, threatening to close off her thoughts, her ability to act impartially. The impossible had happened. The boy she once knew had become the man before her, and she had to reconcile that with her role as a judge. James's eyes met hers. There was recognition, fleeting but undeniable. Then, almost as quickly, he looked away, his head bowing slightly. A quiet moment passed. The courtroom waited. Eleanor forced herself to speak, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside. "Mr. Anderson, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" James's voice was rough, nearly unrecognizable. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her heart pounded, a deafening sound in her ears. She wanted to stop everything, demand answers. What had happened to him? How had their paths diverged so drastically? But as a judge, her role demanded composure, even in the face of this impossible personal conflict. She swallowed hard and motioned for the proceedings to continue. "Proceed," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, as the prosecutor began his opening statements. Eleanor's mind raced as the trial unfolded. This wasn't just any case. This was James. She could feel the pull of the past, her childhood, their shared history, the memories they had made. She tried to focus, to block out the flood of emotions, but they kept breaking through the cracks. Somehow, she had to separate her past from her present. She had to be fair. But how could she be, when every moment reminded her of the boy she once loved? Loved in a way that transcended friendship, even if it had never been spoken aloud? She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, just for a moment, to gather her thoughts. She was transported back to a time long before the black robes and gavel. She and James had grown up on opposite sides of Hammond, Louisiana, divided not by physical distance, but by the unspoken rules of their segregated town. Her family lived in a modest one-story house, complete with a white picket fence. James's family lived at the end of a dirt road in a weathered home surrounded by fields. Their worlds were vastly different, and yet they had found each other. Eleanor remembered how they met. It had been an accident, a chance encounter at the edge of a creek where she had wandered too far from her backyard. James had been fishing, his line tangled in the reeds. She had offered to help, and that simple act of kindness had turned into something more. It had turned into years of secret adventures, shared dreams, and a bond that neither of them could have understood at the time. She remembered one night, lying on the grass beside him under the stars. He had turned to her, his voice soft but serious. "Eleanor, you ever think about leaving this place? Really leaving? Going somewhere where people don't look at us funny just for sitting together?" She had laughed then, brushing off the idea. It had seemed so impossible, so far-fetched. But James wasn't joking. Even as a child, he had seen the world for what it was, a place that didn't always make room for people like him. Their bond had deepened, even in the face of whispers, sideways glances, and outright disapproval from both sides. But the pressure had always been there, like a weight neither of them could shake. Then, one day, it ended. It had been the summer before high school when Eleanor's father caught them sitting together on the porch. His voice had been cold, sharp with authority. "Eleanor, get inside, now." She had hesitated, glancing at James, who had stood frozen in place. "Go on," he had said quietly. "I'll see you around." But they hadn't seen each other again, not really. Her father forbade her from going near James, and soon after, his family moved away. Eleanor threw herself into her studies, her ambitions carrying her far beyond Hammond. She went to law school, chasing dreams of justice, fairness, and equality. But she never forgot the boy who had taught her what courage looked like, the boy who had loved her, in his way, even when the world wouldn't let them be together. As the trial continued, Eleanor found herself constantly torn between her duty as a judge and her past with James. She scanned his record, which showed a series of minor offenses, petty theft, loitering, things that didn't scream a violent nature. But how much of a person's life could you truly see in a few lines on a rap sheet? How much of it was shaped by circumstances beyond their control? The prosecutor was outlining the case, describing how James had allegedly assaulted a store clerk during a robbery at a convenience store in Baton Rouge. The clerk had suffered minor injuries, and the cash register had been emptied. James had been apprehended a few blocks away, the cash still in his possession. It sounded like a straightforward case. Too straightforward, Eleanor thought. She couldn't ignore the doubt gnawing at her. The prosecutor's voice was clinical, detached. "This case is about violence," he said. "It's about a man who walked into a convenience store and, without provocation, attacked an innocent clerk before stealing the contents of the cash register." Eleanor glanced at James. His posture was slouched, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His expression was unreadable. She couldn't tell if he was guilty or if he was being wrongly accused. There was something about the whole thing that felt off, but she couldn't pinpoint it. Was it just the fact that this was James? Or was there more to the story than what the prosecution was claiming? The defense attorney, Lisa Porter, rose to present her opening statement. She was young but confident. Her voice carried across the room, commanding attention. "The prosecution would have you believe this case is straightforward, but it's not," she said. "My client, James Anderson, has maintained his innocence from the start. We will show that there is more to this story. Assumptions made on the night of the arrest do not hold up under scrutiny." The first witness called to the stand was the store clerk who had been working that night. He described seeing a man fitting James's description enter the store, argue with the cashier, and then lunge over the counter. The clerk's testimony was detailed, but something about it felt rehearsed, almost scripted. Eleanor felt a prickle of doubt. Was this witness credible? Did he really see the person who committed the assault? Or was he simply going through the motions? Lisa's cross-examination was sharp, like a surgeon wielding a scalpel. "Mr. Chambers, you stated that the man who attacked the clerk was wearing a red hoodie. Is that correct?" she asked. The witness nodded. "Yes." "And did you see his face clearly?" Lisa pressed. "No," the witness admitted. "It was dark, and he had the hood up." Lisa's eyes narrowed, and she didn't miss a beat. "So, you're saying you couldn't definitively identify the individual who committed the assault?" The witness hesitated. "Well, no." Lisa nodded, cutting him off. No further questions. Eleanor noticed James shift slightly in his seat. His shoulders squared, as if the exchange had given him a glimmer of hope. Could this be the break his defense team needed? The next piece of evidence was a grainy surveillance video from the store. It showed a figure in a red hoodie entering the store, grabbing at the counter before disappearing off-screen. The quality was so poor that it was difficult to discern any identifying features. The prosecution argued that the figure was James, but Eleanor wasn't so sure. She leaned forward, studying the footage with intense focus. Could this truly be James? The defense's strategy was to present an alibi. James claimed he had been walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery. However, the friend was unwilling to testify, citing fear of retaliation from the community. Lisa argued that the lack of a willing witness didn't negate James's innocence, but Eleanor could feel the weight of the jury's skepticism. How could they believe in James's innocence without solid evidence to back it up? As the trial wore on, Eleanor felt the weight of her position pressing down on her. She was meant to be impartial, a pillar of fairness, but how could she be when every moment reminded her of their childhood? The boy who had once been her closest friend was now a man fighting for his freedom, and she was the one tasked with determining his fate. When the defense called James to testify, he stood up slowly, his chains clinking softly with each step. His voice, though quiet, carried a raw sincerity. "I've made mistakes in my life," he began, addressing the jury directly. "I've taken wrong turns, trusted the wrong people, but I didn't do this. That night, I was walking home. I was stopped by the cops. They didn't ask questions. They just decided I fit the bill." His voice cracked slightly as he continued, his eyes locked on the jury. "I've been fighting my whole life, fighting to be seen as more than what people assume about me. But this, I'm tired. I just want the truth to matter." Eleanor's throat tightened as his words cut through the courtroom, echoing in the silence that followed. His testimony wasn't just a defense of his innocence. It was a plea for humanity, for understanding. She glanced at the jury. Their faces were a mix of doubt, empathy, and uncertainty. The truth was no longer confined to evidence or testimonies. It was a battle of conscience. The final day of the trial arrived. The closing arguments were delivered with precision. The prosecutor leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence, urging the jury to trust the system and the process. Lisa, however, pleaded for the jury to see beyond the surface, to look at the holes in the case, and to remember the humanity of the man on trial. Eleanor listened intently, her mind racing. Her role was clear. She could not sway the jury, but she would have the final word if their verdict left room for interpretation. The burden of ensuring justice weighed heavily on her shoulders. The jury deliberated for hours. When they finally reached a verdict, the courtroom fell silent. The foreperson stood, holding a piece of paper in her trembling hands. "In the case of the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson," she began, "we find the defendant." The pause was unbearable. Eleanor's heart raced as the room held its breath. "Not guilty." The courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps, murmurs, and even a few cheers. Eleanor tapped her gavel, restoring order. James's shoulders sagged, as if a weight had been lifted from him, but his face remained unreadable. He had won his freedom, but it was clear this victory came at a cost. As the courtroom emptied, Eleanor lingered behind, watching James as he signed his release paperwork. For a moment, she thought he might leave without a word, but then he turned and approached her. The room was nearly empty now, save for a few clerks tidying up, and Margaret gathering files. James stopped a few feet from the bench, his expression guarded. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly, his voice tinged with something Eleanor couldn't quite place. "But I'd like to know, why didn't you say anything? You knew me." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. The words caught in her chest, her emotions threatening to spill over. "Because I couldn't," she whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. "I had to be fair. If I'd said something, it might have jeopardized the case." James studied her, his face a mix of hurt and understanding. "Fair? That's the thing, Eleanor," he said softly. "The world's never been fair. Not for people like me." She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the polished wood of the bench. "You're right," she said quietly. "I wish I'd done more back then. I wish I could have done more now." James sighed, his posture easing slightly. "We were kids. We didn't know any better." "But you know now, don't you?" Eleanor asked, her voice firm. "I do," James replied. He gave a faint nod and turned, walking away, his back straight as he disappeared through the courthouse doors. Eleanor sat alone in the empty courtroom, the weight of his words pressing on her. She had upheld the law, but the trial had revealed a deeper truth. Justice wasn't just about verdicts and evidence. It was about the lives shaped by systems far larger than any one person. As she left the courtroom that evening, the fading sun casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, Eleanor made a silent vow. She couldn't change the past, but she would do everything in her power to ensure the future held more than hollow promises of fairness. It would be hard, perhaps even impossible, but she owed it to James and to herself to try.